bless you. Thanks.
And I'm going to just listen.
Well, I hope you have some questions as well.
Sorry, I've got 3 people in. Yeah. Everybody's being tardy on arriving at this meeting.
Yeah, well, I got stuck in load shedding traffic where all the robots are out. So I don't know,
Right.
maybe some other people are struggling as well.
Yeah, I'm sure that's possible. Yeah. Oops. Should we just shut our cameras off, or you can shut your camera off until I've got a few more people in? And
Yeah, sure.
If you'd like to, I mean, yeah, I'll just keep mine on as a sort of hosty chap.
Yeah, just shout when you're ready to start.
Okay, great, lovely. I think, folks, we'll give people 5 more minutes or so. It seems that's we've got people who haven't quite made it yet. Good evening, Daryl.
Hi, how are you, Jeremy?
Hi, Fred. How are you, folks?
How are you? Yes.
Good. I'm delighted that you've got a glass of wine in your hand.
Always, always. I'm not behind the camera. I've got a glass of wine in my hand.
I've noted that. I'll ask everybody to mute their phones and shut their cameras down until we do some questions a little bit later, please, if that's okay. And the other thing is I'm recording, just to let you folks know. It's just it advised me that there's a privacy policy, and I need to let you know that you're being recorded. I think we'll just give the folks a couple more minutes until 7:05. People are still joining. Good evening, Greg.
Hi, Jeremy. How's it?
How are you doing?
Good, and you? Thank you.
Very fine. Thanks very much. I was down in Hermanus today, or down in Stamford, having a look at the vineyard whose grapes we're about to taste in a little while. And boy, oh boy, it was so windy today, and it was almost blown off my feet, actually.
Sure. Yeah.
Piggies aren't in the vineyard at the moment. Piggies at work. Piggies were hiding. Hi, Tim.
Hey, Jeremy. Yeah, I'm good. How are you?
Welcome. Great, thank you. I'm going to ask you to just pop off your camera and your mic in a minute. We're just waiting a couple of minutes to let a few more people in, and then we'll be good to go. I hope you got a glass of wine, even if it's the wrong one.
I'll go get one.
You need one. You can't do this without a glass of wine.
I've got one, Jeremy, and it's never the wrong one.
Well, I'm delighted. I think occasionally it is.
Yes, no, that's true. I'll go with that.
Right.
And I'll now mute.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I think we'll give people one more minute.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask Rosie to come in. Actually, I think we can't hang around and wait forever for people that are late. So can you hear me, Rosie?
Yeah, I'm back.
All right. Okay. I'll just want to say I just want to say a very warm welcome to all you folks, and thank you very much for coming and joining us this evening. And thank you to those of you who have contributed to our funding effort. Our tasting actually is supposed to only be for the crowdfunders, but we got a little bit loose, and some other folks who've helped us along the way are also joining us. It gives me great pleasure actually to welcome Rosie, and I'm going to have to read her biography from my phone. She has she's from the UK, as you can tell by her very polished accent, and she has a background in wildlife monitoring and management, particularly with a particular interest in large carnivores. And she joined the African Parks team at Majeti Game Reserve in Malawi in 2021. With a mandate of overseeing their biodiversity conservation portfolio. She's got an undergraduate in planetary science, which sounds very interesting, right? And then a couple of postgraduate degrees, as one does, in environmental science and natural resource management, and in science communication. So that's also an interesting one. And she's also a FAGASA qualified guide. So she's quite a useful lady to have around when you're in the bush. She's worked on conservation projects throughout Africa, right up in West Africa and Sierra Leone, and in Botswana, and most recently in Malawi. And you know, as I guess with people of her ilk, she's published as well. So I think I'll just sort of give you a little bit of a background as to how we're going to try and run the thing this evening. You must excuse me; I've never run one of these in my life before, so if it's not quite as professional as some of the other people you visit on Teams, well, that will just have to be. So what we'll do is Rosie will talk a little bit about her background and the organization that she works for, and then at a convenient space we'll dip into the first one, and I'll tell you a little bit about it, and then Rosie will pick up with other tales and stories and the like, and then we'll go into the next one at also a convenient at points in the whole discussion. From our perspective, my sister Amanda and I grew up in Malawi, and when we were kids, we used to go to Lengwi Game Reserve, which is not too far from Majeti, and then up to Kasungu, which is a project that's I think African Parks are busy with right now to reinstate. But Majeti was really like the Wild West. I mean, and nobody went there, I don't think. I guess a couple of people did. I think you could go and hunt there. They had a very, very restricted hunting permit for Malawi in those days. Most of the game had already been shot out in the country. But I think it was a forestry reserve, if I'm not at all mistaken, and one could actually go and shoot a poor bushbuck or a couple of nyala or something over there. And anyway, Painted Wolf have a relationship with the Endangered Wildlife Trust, and some years ago they got involved with these projects to translocate African wild dogs to various other countries, the African Wild Dog Range Expansion Project. And we were absolutely delighted to be asked to contribute to this project throughout the previous 9 or so years that we made donations to the Endangered Wildlife Trust, I think we bought petrol and bootlaces for people, because we were never prescriptive in any manner about where the money should be spent. We just let them get on and spend it. But anyway, we were invited to help fund this really incredible, high-profile, wonderful conservation effort. And some of our funding went directly to either airplane hire or to buy the special translocation boxes that the dogs that ended up under Rosie's care were translocated to Malawi. And I think without any further nonsense from me, I'll let Rosie start telling you about what she does and all that stuff. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you very much for inviting me. When Amanda called me the other day and said, would I be interested in drinking wine and talking about wild dogs? And I said, sounds like my perfect evening. So of course. And it just so happened to coincide. I'm working in the head office in Johannesburg this week, which was ideal because the internet in Majetti is less than reliable. So it probably wouldn't have worked out. So I'm very pleased that I'm in Joburg and was able to join this evening. So yeah, thank you for the lovely introduction. As you touched on already, I'm working for African Parks. I'm sure most of you have heard of African Parks, but maybe not got a lot of background into what the organization does and how it started. And that's relevant, particularly for me, because Majetti was their very first park. So it's sort of our baby park for African Parks, and we've been around for a long time now. So as I said, our head office is here in Johannesburg, and that's because it was set up by 4 South Africans who were previously involved with sandparks and were very high up in sandparks, but started to realize that outside of South Africa, a lot of protected areas were only protected on paper, and the reality on the ground was that there was very intensive encroachment, a lot of deforestation, and a lot of poaching. And they were seriously concerned that if a solid organization didn't take over these protected areas elsewhere in Africa, then we were going to lose them very quickly. It just so happened that they were in Malawi at one time, and one of the original founders was living in Malawi, and they were very interested actually in Luande National Park, which is another park in Malawi, but it was a functioning park, and the government weren't interested in African Parks taking that on. So they offered us Majetti instead, which, as Jeremy already touched on, was a bit of a wasteland, honestly. It was gazetted in 1951, but again, only on paper. And between the 1950s and the 1990s, pretty much everything was completely wiped out. We've got beautiful diary records of the warden who was there in the 1950s, who talked about huge herds of elephants, lots of lions, all your different species, and including wild dogs. There's a beautiful entry that he talks about sitting in a baobab tree with a pack of wild dogs playing in the water beneath him. And that was in 1956. And that's the very last record of wild dogs in Majetti, and the last known resident pack of wild dogs in Malawi. But over time, everything was poached out. And so when African Parks arrived in 2003, we took over this park, and it was basically completely devoid of wildlife. I think they say there are a couple of duiker, maybe a couple of warthogs left, but otherwise absolutely empty. And if you have the pleasure of visiting Majetti now, that will blow your mind, because it's absolutely packed with animals. We just did our aerial census last week and counted over 12,500 animals in 5 days. So wow. It's doing extremely well. And so African Parks philosophy is a business approach to conservation, and that it has to be financially sustainable, socially sustainable with the communities, and also ecologically sustainable. And all of those things have to be in balance. So my job is the ecological side, but obviously we're all working in coordination together. So when we start looking at a park, we target these parks that are struggling, that are financially struggling, that don't have any tourism revenue, that have got no animals left, and are not providing any tangible benefits for local communities, because that's where we can have the most impact. And so that was where we started in Majetti. And the process has been incredible. We had to there were no fences, and Malawi is one of the most heavily human populated countries in Africa. So if you fly across Majetti, it's a beautiful lush green park, and then you hit the boundary and it just turns into crops. It's a very harsh boundary between inside and outside park. So if we hadn't fenced it, then we're going to run into issues with encroachment, but also with wildlife leaving the park and causing conflict with the local communities. So we put in 144 kilometers of fence line, and that's one of the highest quality predator-proof fencing that you'll find in Africa. And as a result, we have basically no breakouts at all, which is pretty remarkable. We had to put roads in. There were no roads in the park, and you can't manage a park if there's no roads, but also you're not going to get tourists if they can't travel around the park. All these sorts of infrastructure, housing for staff, offices, boreholes to create a gradient of water across the park so that we can make sure the wildlife is utilizing all the areas. And it was a huge undertaking. But the most exciting part for me anyway is the reintroductions. So we've been reintroducing animals now for 20 years into the park, starting with rhinos, and the last species was the wild dogs, and they came last year. And that was quite honestly one of the most overwhelmingly emotional experiences I've had in my career. That having these dogs arrive into Malawi after more than 60 years of absence, seeing them land on the main at the main airport on the tarmac, and people sitting in the airport probably wondering what on earth is going on. We start unloading these dogs onto the tarmac, and then driving them through the city on the back of the truck with literally thousands of people lining the roads. It was really quite a phenomenal experience. I have some photos of that, which I can show a bit later on, to give you a bit of an idea of what that looks like.
Did the people sing the dogs into Majetti?
Well, unfortunately, by the time we arrived, it was really late and already dark, so a lot of people didn't come out, but there was a pretty good crowd, and particularly a lot of our rangers came because they've worked in the park for 10, 20 years and never seen a wild dog in their lives, so they were really excited about it. So there were a lot of cheers as they came out the crates, which was really exciting.
How exciting!
Yeah.
And it was a huge task to get them to you.
No, absolutely.
I don't know whether Cole's here. I'm not sure that Cole managed to get on. I think he's busy, but I think he had a tortuous time getting them up there. They traveled on the night of Jacob Zuma's revolution, and they had to be turned back, and then the permits all had to be reapplied for again, and you know it was one of the most difficult translocations, I think, of that the EWT's experienced over the years, but they got there safely, and yeah. So should we taste the first wine, folks, and before we move on? So, ladies and gentlemen, if you would charge your glasses with hopefully with some lightning, but if you don't, with something else, I know there's one or two in our group who prefer to have a cup of tea than a glass of wine, and that's fine too. So anyway, this is Lightning Sauvignon Blanc, and it's a 2021 vintage. And I'm going to just stick a little bit in my glass. Okay, so this is a really special and somewhat unusual Sauvignon Blanc. It comes primarily from a very small vineyard in a place called Stamford, and the grower the vineyard guy has 3 hectares of grapes in total, of which 1 hectare is Sauvignon, and then there's 2 hectares of Shiraz. The vineyard, the soil is something called calcrete, and calcrete is a very light sort of white soil. It's produced from mineral salts that are pushed up from under the earth by water, and the salts are pushed onto the top of the soil, and when the water evaporates, they're deposited. They're a sort of calcium type soil, so they have some similarities to the sorts of soils that you find in France and in the Loire Valley in Sancerre and Puy-Fumé, where which is one of the motherlands of Sauvignon Blanc. And this wine actually probably has a lot more to do in its style with the type of wine that you would actually find in those regions in northern France. Sauvignon Blanc characteristically is one of the most academic type of winemaking wines to make. It the sort of Sauvignon Blanc revolution that's really put New Zealand's wine industry on the map was founded on a very academic type of winemaking that relied on the absolute absence of oxygen with the wine, and often relied on various sorts of enzymes that push the aromatics of the wine up and stuff like this. This wine is made the old-fashioned way, so it's got its own yeast, none of those sorts of enzymes, and made in a little bit of an oxidative way for the juice, and you get a very different type of aroma. So you give the wine a nice smell, and the aromatics are kind of slightly salty and sort of somewhat a little bit spicy, and maybe a little bit dusty as well. And the aroma of the wine, which I'm spilling it. It's so exciting to leave my glasses. And the fruit is sort of on the sort of herbaceous spectrum that you'd expect from Sauvignon Blanc, but it's not that really kind of pungent sort of cat pee type of aroma that you sometimes get from Sauvignon. And the palate is fabulous. I mean, it's got a really punchy palate, this wine. I mean, the entry of the wine is really bright. The middle of the wine is creamy. The wine is actually was fermented in some plastic eggs, 600-liter plastic egg-shaped vessels, and they give a very large surface area to the lees, which are basically dead yeast cells, and a lot of exposure to lees in wine makes the wine creamy. And so something like 40% was fermented in these plastic eggs, and the balance was fermented in old wooden barrels. And the old wooden barrels had previously had other white wine in them, which had undergone that malolactic fermentation that is so popular with Chardonnay, which is actually a little type of yeast that eats malic acid, and it basically digests it and changes the structure of the acid, changes the number of carbon and hydrogen ions in the acid, and it basically poops the acid out. And when it comes out of the, I don't know, actually, I'm not sure whether the physiology of a yeast can do that, but whatever it is, however, it actually extrudes the once it's finished consuming the malic acid, it's lactic acid, and then the extra carbon ions in the thing bubble off as carbon dioxide, and it changes the flavor and the structure. It changes the flavor from being something that is the flavor of like real green apples to something that's sort of like creamy butterscotch type of a characteristic. So a portion of this wine has been through that process, and you can actually taste the little bit slightly sort of creamy butterscotchy type of character in the middle of the wine. And the wine has got very high acidity, natural. That place, as I mentioned, I don't know whether you were listening when I mentioned to Greg how unbelievably windy it is there. I think it's one of the windiest vineyard sites anywhere. With all that wind helps the site retain acidity. So yeah, nice, really, really bright wine, but it doesn't feel at all manufactured. I mean, it's sort of like really a very honest drop of Sauvignon. And Lightning, Lightning was a dog in the Kruger Park. So we have a number of wines that respected conservation professionals have suggested names for. We need a dog from Rosie as well. We need one of your dogs for a wine. So you can give it some thought. And yeah, so Lightning was the alpha male of the Skakusa pack in the Kruger Park, and he was very he had a really distinguishing marking on his one flank that looked like a great big flash. The extraordinary thing with Lightning is that he lived until he was 12. And if any of you who've been to that area around Skakusa along that lower Sabi will know, the riverfront will know that it's absolutely festooned with lions and leopards. And to be an artful dodger and manage 12 without being taken out by some other predator is quite extraordinary. And they reckon that he sired at least 70 puppies over the course of his life. May well be more than that. So the likelihood is that if you visit the area around Skakusa into Sabi Sands, that area, that any dog that you see now is likely to be related to him, because he had such a far-reaching influence. There aren't any other dogs with speed stripes on them, unfortunately. There's that got lost in a splodge on some dog's body. So anyway, I think I'll revert to Rosie. She can tell you a bit more about what she does. And cheers, enjoy the Sauvignon. We'll pick up on the blend a bit later.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, I think you made a critical point just before we took a break, that Cole from Endangered Wildlife Trust actually has the difficult job. My job is easy. Once the dogs arrive in the park, he has the challenge of deciding which dogs to translocate and how to bond them with other dogs. So the process that he goes through involves a lot of spreadsheets, a lot of DNA testing, and a lot of luck as well, and good timing. So normally in a wild dog society, you have an alpha male and an alpha female in your pack, and they're the only ones that are breeding. And each year the yearlings stay on and help raise the next year's puppies. They're seasonal breeders, so they just breed once a year, and then normally in around April-May time. And the offspring that survive will stay on in the pack and help raise the next litter the next year. But eventually your pack is going to get to a size where it can't sustain itself in terms of the amount of food that it can provide. Dogs are prolific hunters. A big pack will hunt every day, usually twice a day, and that might mean 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 impalas a day. And this is why historically they've been heavily persecuted, because they can really have a big impact on your antelope population. And if you're a game farmer in particular, like we have in a lot of places in South Africa, where your income is entirely reliant on producing antelopes, then when wild dogs are breaking into your into your reserve, into your farm, they can really put a big dent in your antelope population. So this is why they've been very heavily persecuted over the years. So when the pack reaches a critical point where the most subordinate dogs are no longer getting enough food, then they have a change of heart and decide they're not going to stay and look after next year's pups and break away. And Cole uses that opportunity usually. That's the ideal opportunity to capture up those dogs that have already made the decision mentally to break away from their families. And normally it's a single sex group. So you'll have a group of males have broken away or a group of females have broken away. And then he'll try and find a matching group that he can then artificially bond together. So normally these dogs will go out and they'll disperse sometimes more than 1,000 kilometers looking for dogs of the opposite sex, so they can form a new pack on their own, and ideally ones that are unrelated. And Cole does the love matchmaking on their behalf by capturing them and introducing them in a boma. So initially with a dividing fence until they've decided that they do love each other, and then eventually they open up the gates and let the dogs form a pack. And this can be really tricky. It's not an exact science. A lot of times it doesn't work. Dogs, they have personalities like us, and they just decide sometimes they don't like the girls, or the girls don't like the boys. And so it doesn't always work, and it's an incredibly stressful part of the job. For the Majetti dogs, it was actually went incredibly smoothly. So both our males and our females came from Mozambique, but from two different parks. The boys came from Gorongosa and the girls from Karangani. And the boys broke away from their pack, and Cole captured them and took them to the boma at Karangani, getting ready to then go out and dart the females so that he could bring them to the boma and to introduce them. But the next day, the females were at the gate of the boma wanting to be let in, ready. There was love at first sight, and they'd made the decision for him and made it very easy. So that was brilliant because they bonded
Saved on
really,
some
really
helicopter
quickly.
time.
Sorry?
Saved on some helicopter time.
Yes, exactly. And it reduces a lot of stress in the dogs as well, because they had chosen, there was no aggression. They were really tightly bonded very quickly, which is great. So then they have to sit in a boma for quite a long time while we get the paperwork, and they have to go through quarantine and have all their vaccinations. To translocate cross-country borders, they have to be rabies vaccinated, and you have to get your CITES permits. And that can sometimes take a lot of time, as I'm sure you can imagine, red tape in Africa. And then we also had the issue of the protests, which then delayed the move as well. But they did eventually come, and also along with 8 dogs that went to Luwande National Park, and they were put on the plane that was sponsored by Painted Wolf Wines and arrived in Malawi at the international airport in Blantyre. So this was incredibly exciting. The plane lands on the main tarmac with everybody in the airport terminal watching, and we start pulling these dogs out of the plane. Cole knew very well which dogs were coming to Majetti. We didn't know. He had labelled them, so that was good. But it was quite an intense time, because we had a very short window of opportunity to get our dogs out, and then the plane was taking off again to then land directly in Luwande with their dogs, and they can only land on the bush airstrip during daylight hours, and it was starting to get dark, so it was a little bit chaotic, made worse by the fact that one of the Luwande dogs was overheating in the plane, and her heart rate had dropped very low, so we actually had to take her out. We had to run to the cafe in the airport and get as much ice cubes as we could from their Coke machine and cover this dog on the tarmac with ice, and have her on a drip. So it was a little bit mad. I'm sure the Malawians thought, what are these people doing? but it was at no point was I worried. When you're working with organizations like Endangered Wildlife Trust and the vets, Rowan, that they is one of South Africa's top wild dog vets. That they're just they know exactly what they're doing. They're so calm, take everything in their stride. They've thought through all the potential things that can go wrong, so nothing comes as a shock. So everything actually happened very smoothly. So as soon as our dogs were loaded into crates and put on the back of a bucky, or 2 buckies, we actually left the guys with the Luande dogs on the tarmac and said, "You guys deal with this. We're going to get our dogs back down to Majete as quickly as possible." So then that's a 2-hour drive back down the mountain. It's a steep escarpment on quite treacherous and terrifying roads at the best of time. But when you've got dogs in the back of your vehicle, you're probably the most precious dogs in the world at that point. It was very nerve-wracking. But as I said, once we got them into the park and opened up the crates, they all woke up very nicely and ran out into the boma, and that was great. So that's when my job starts. So for the first 4 weeks, we keep them in the boma to let them settle down and get used to their new surroundings, learn the smells of Malawi. But also it gives us a chance to get to know the dogs. I literally was spending 4 or 5 hours a day at the boma, just taking pictures of the dogs, making observations, understanding who is the alphas, learning the different personalities, creating ID kits that we use. So we identify them by their different spot patterns, just like Lightning had his lightning bolt down the side. They all have very unique spot patterns. And also, just as importantly, getting them used to me. It's really important for their long-term management that they're not afraid of people in the right situations. We don't want them running up to members of the public. Say, for instance, if they did get out the park, it would be disastrous if they ran into a village because people would be scared of them. But I have to be able to get close enough to them if we need to dart them for any reason. Every year we have to rabies vaccinate them. That's the wild dog management policy for Africa. And if they're always running away from us, then that's a problem. So we do very strategic habituation training with them, where we arrive and act in certain ways so that they recognize us, and they very quickly know me, and they know my vehicle, they know my voice. My boss always laughs because he thinks I'm feeding them sausages or something, because they come to my vehicle and say hello when I'm driving through the bush. But I don't. But it's a really important part of the job. It is building that relationship and a two-way relationship. So sorry, I'm just getting interrupted by someone. So that took about 4 weeks. One of our dogs, when she arrived, was pregnant. So we unexpectedly we weren't anticipating having a pregnant dog when they arrived. So we were considering keeping them in the boma for longer. It becomes a bit of a challenge knowing when to release if they're going to den. But unfortunately, she did in fact abort. I think the stress of the translocation was too much. But even though it's sad, it was actually, for the management purposes, it was better. Rather let them settle in the park, get to know the park, and settle down before we have to deal with puppies on top of everything else. So after 4 weeks, we let them out. This pack, the girls are extremely dominant over the males, actually. The smallest dog in the pack, a female called Josie, is extremely confident, and she was the first one to come out the boma as soon as we opened the gate, brimming with confidence, strutted out and was like, "Come on, guys, what are we doing?" Very quickly followed by the other 2 females. The 3 males much more timid and didn't want to come out, so we had to wait for about 4 hours in the roasting hot sun for the boys to come out. But eventually they did, and that's when it starts to become nerve-wracking. So Cole kept warning us, you've got to keep track of these dogs. Dogs are notorious for breaking out of reserves. Fences are no challenge for wild dogs, and in South Africa it's a big challenge for the wild dog conservation teams because they're chasing dogs that are just literally going through reserves and crossing large distances. The problem in Malawi is that the parks are all very isolated little islands, as I was saying, surrounded by very dense human population. So if they break out, it's almost certain death for the dogs. So that's when the first few weeks were very intense. But I'm very pleased to say that Majeti's wild dogs are probably the most well-behaved dogs in the planet. We have had no issues with them whatsoever. Every 3 months. Up until now.
Up until now.
Yeah.
They're bound actually just to deal a curveball at some stage. That's what they do.
Yes, and it will probably happen when I'm not in the park because that's usually what happens.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
But no, they we have quarterly meetings with all the parks that have wild dogs to discuss issues, and everyone hates me because they all have had breakouts or snaring incidents or various issues with their dogs, and every quarter I report, yeah, no issues, dogs are well behaved.
I think it's probably that just because it's just that you're so charming, probably.
But we had even they don't go wandering very much at all. They stick to quite a small area, and for the first 6 months they pretty much sat outside my house, so they made the monitoring really easy. I didn't have to drive very far to find them. And then in the beginning of this year we were hit by 2 very big cyclones, and
Yeah, geez, yeah.
Needless to say, the fences were washed away in a lot of places, and so I'm tracking my dogs. I'll explain a little bit in more detail later how we do that. But I'm watching these dogs walk along the fence line where there's no fence anymore, and they could easily just walk out and go into the farmland where there's goats and cows and everything else. But no, they just carry on walking along as if the fence is still there. For some reason, they've got no ambitions to go outside whatsoever. So I'm very pleased with them for doing that. It makes my life easy.
That's very interesting that they didn't cross the fence line. But I suppose on the other side of the fence, in this extremely populous area where there's basically only mango trees and probably dead millies by that time, there's just no cover for them.
No, and I think the habitat in Majeti is just beautiful. So
yes.
Yeah, I think there's no need for them to go outside. There's plenty of prey for them in the park, and they're very happy.
I must say, when I saw those videos of the Sherry River pouring down and creating a new channel through the reserve, I was really concerned that would be curtains for those dogs.
Yeah, and no, it was a mind-blowing amount of water. We had over 350 millimeters fell in about 2 hours. So I've never seen rain like that in my life, and the noise of the river was quite phenomenal.
Scary, huh?
Yeah, we did lose a few animals, not many. We lost a couple of cheetah cubs, but for the most part, actually, somehow the animals know and they move away from the rivers. I had a collared elephant just that I was watching and always hangs around at the river, and then about 6 hours before the cyclone hit, that elephant moved really far inland. So she knew something was happening and moved away from the water. So somehow these animals have a better insight to the natural world.
The extraordinary thing is that elephant was translocated there.
Yeah.
That elephant is not relying on established memory of the place.
No,
so, which is quite extraordinary, because elephants obviously they have cultural knowledge, but for I think, did they come from those ones? They were the ones that came from up against the escarpment near the bottom end of Lake Malawi.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Mind you, they probably knew a little bit about low pressure.
Yeah, so I think they're detecting pressure changes, and obviously they can hear from a lot further away than us. So I think they hear the rain coming, and also the the change in the sound of the water in the river as it's building in momentum.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
I mean, it's really extraordinary. I
extraordinary.
mean, that's knowledge that is just out of our realm of understanding, and we
Yeah.
can't do that.
No.
Yeah.
No, but no, they've been great, and this pattern of good behavior has continued. Even when they started denning, they decided to den right by the main road and the main access from the gate to the lodge. So tourists are seeing the dogs every day, even when they're denning, which is remarkable, because often what happens when they're about to den is they disappear off into the deepest depths of the parks where no one can access them, and that's exactly what happened in Luande. Their dogs denned in a really inaccessible part of the park where even the researchers were unable to get to them. My dogs, no, they denned about 2 meters off the road, within about 50 meters of the entrance gate. So
We
again,
need
very well
to
behaved.
host our wine and wild dog safari with you, because
Yes.
we've done it in Gonra Zoo 4 or 5 times, and I think twice. And we've been up there, and I know Jessica Watermeyer, and she's got a really good team, and they were scouring the park for dogs, and I think on the one occasion we were unable to find any at all. So people paid a great deal of money to come on this very high-end safari where we were supposed to take them to go and sit with dogs on a den and stuff like that, and we just couldn't find one. And the other time we did find dogs, but we had about literally about 5 minutes with them. People had a lot of nice wine, so that was all right. I mean, that sort of made up for it. And the birding there is very good, and it's a really smashing place. But yeah, when you're pitching a wine and wild dog safari to people, we do need to find a few dogs for people to see.
Well, come to Majetti. We'll do our best.
Yeah. Yeah. Lovely. Should we move on and have a go with the second wine? Great stuff. So, all right, boys and girls, you need to charge your glasses if you haven't done so already with this next little guy. And this is Pictus number 8. I'll just pop that up there. With a really beautiful piece of artwork. I'll put a little drop in my glass. So before I talk about the wine, I'll talk a little bit about the artwork. I mean, this painting is by an artist called Keith Joubert, and Keith Joubert is the late brother of the sort of very famous National Geographic Explorer in Residence filmmaker Derek Joubert. Keith was an incredibly wonderful wildlife artist who had a capacity to really capture feeling of animals in his work. I mean, he's not a precise chocolate box type illustrative wildlife artist like some are. I mean, his work is really dynamic and sort of almost impressionistic in style. And we knew Beverly and Derek Joubert from years ago when Emma and I worked in Savuti in Botswana, and they were making one of their films over there. And I was actually the cook at the camp. And actually, we have Daryl Balfour here, who I also cooked for on numerous occasions and all way back when. But Beverly Joubert is a vegetarian vegan, and they used to pop into camp. And because I'd been living in California for 8 or 9 years and had worked as a chef there, I knew a little bit about cooking that type of food. I think we were the only place in Botswana that was serving vegan food to people in those days, and nothing of it came out of a box. It was everything that we could get from Kasane, so it was made with local things. And so, but anyway, they I think they appreciated it, and they sort of stayed in touch for a while. And then when we were looking for a label, we popped a note, and we were given permission to use 2 pieces from, and they are the only 2 pieces that Keisha ever did of wild dogs. So I'll just show you again. This is actually an incredible painting. It's so incredibly dynamic and beautiful. The wine itself is also dynamic and beautiful. So it's a rather unusual blend. These series of wines that I've produced called Pictus are reflective of actually what the word Pictus means, which is something that is painted and represented. And every single wine that's gone into the Pictus range has been a little bit different, but they've all had a sort of theme about them. I'm a very proud exponent of warm climate viticulture and of warm climate winemaking. We actually live in a warm place in South Africa, and there are some cooler sites, but really to embrace what our winemaking world is now and our winemaking potential is you need to think of the fact that we're actually a hot place. So this one, number 8, is based on a very ubiquitous and widely planted Mediterranean grape variety called Carignan. And Carignan is one of the old grape varieties. When they look at the geographical spread of grapes, and I'm talking geographical spread before the discovery of the New World, or discovery by Caucasian people of the New World, and then the transfer of grapes as a consequence of that to South Africa and Australia and North America. But throughout the places that are the sort of heartland of viticulture, those grape varieties that are widely spread are generally the ones that are really old. And Carignan is, well, almost certainly was taken throughout the Mediterranean by either Phoenicians or Greeks. It's found in Lebanon and Israel, Palestine, throughout North Africa, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and then right through the south of France and Spain and Sardinia and Greece. It has 100 different synonyms as well because it's old. So every country and every little culture's got its own name for it. So that variety makes 31% of this wine. And Carignan is dark, tannic, acidic. Much of it is on its own is potentially, well, if not unpleasant, just a little bit tough. But it's really, really like a foundation stone. It's like plonking a big piece of concrete with rebar into the base of your building to build it. And then on top of it, there is Grenache Noir, which is a light-colored grape variety that has a quite a sort of essency, lifted fruit aromatic, quite often sort of in the sort of strawberry type aromatics, and also a little bit of pepperiness. And then it's got this one's got a real curveball. It's got Grenache Gris, and there's just one vineyard of Grenache Gris in South Africa. And I bought a little bit of Grenache Gris thinking I might make rosé wine with it, but I actually found that it was a good blending component in this one. You can see the wine is dark in color. I mean, if you look at it, so it's a really quite an intense dark wine, but it's got something like 20% rosé in it, which just goes to show how dark some of the other components are in it. And then it has Mourvèdre, which is another old Southern European variety that's also widely spread around the Mediterranean basin, and then a bit of Shiraz. So if this wine was a European wine, the closest it would be is a Spanish appellation called Priorat, which is something like about 100 or 150 kilometers north of Barcelona, in the mountains. They have a very specific soil there. We don't have that type of soil. So their soil is a slate, which we don't have in South Africa. But yeah, those wines are earthy and savory, which this wine is too. So I mean, when you put a blend like this together, I mean, what you're trying to look for is a wine that has a lot of harmony that has no edges, no pointy bits sticking out. That's just that's really very sort of beautifully holistic. The grapes are actually from two geographical areas. There's grapes from Wellington, which is quite warm, and then there's some Swartland grapes in it as well. So it's a multi-regional blend. And if you give it a good sniff, have you got a drop of that wine? There we are.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Good job. Good job. So yeah, it's the aromatics are quite sort of savory and meaty. I mean, the fruit is not, it doesn't jump out of the glass at all, and the fruit that's there is more in the kind of fruitcake sort of spectrum rather than anything that's sort of identifiably primary fruit aromatics. It has really a lot of depth aromatically as well. And it's really mouth coating. It absolutely fills your mouth with flavor. And then it's got a really quite gentle but persistent finish. The acid of the wine is relatively low. The acidity is quite gentle, and the tannin is also there is tannin in the wine, but the tannin is not big and rich and hard tannin. It's also very beautifully integrated with the wine. I mean, this wine is not showy at all, so it's sort of, if it goes into a big fancy competition, it might get skipped over. But sitting in your home and drinking this wine with food, and it will do really well with well seasoned, quite sort of flavoursome food. I mean, it's a very satisfying type of a wine experience. And I think if one was to buy a few cases of this wine and chuck it into your cellar for a few years, that in 5 or 7 or 10 years time it will be a really fantastic wine. So anyway, over to you.
Thank you. So yeah, I think what I want to move on to now is about what I actually do with the dogs now that they're settled in the park, and what the long-term management of them is. So it's absolutely critical that we monitor them straight after release to make sure that they're settled down. That's the most sort of high risk period of time. But as I said, our dogs settled very quickly. But then in the longer term, dogs are incredibly susceptible to snaring. That's one of the highest causes of death in South Africa, particularly in Kruger, death or injury from snaring, and high risk of breaking out. Can
I just sort of jump in quickly with a point here. Within it's not really widely known or widely broadcast that there's an extremely high amount of bushmeat harvesting in the Kruger Park, both with snares and with people hunting with packs of dogs. And there are some real hotspots. I mean, all the energy and all the news stories are all about rhinoceroses, but that's only just one part of a much more complicated story. And the rhino stuff just takes up so much energy that there's a lot of other really very detrimental things that are happening, but there's just not enough resource to actually tackle that as well. And I think in the parks in Malawi, where there's literally hundreds of thousands of protein poor people living outside the parks, it's an absolute war of attrition. Yeah. to secure the reserves so that the animals are not you know, and I mean, snares are the most indiscriminate and most awful way of actually dispatching of animals, and they're so non-selective and just dreadful.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's absolutely right. One of the biggest jobs for the wild dog teams in Kruger is monitoring dog movements and identifying snaring events. We're lucky in Malawi that elephant and rhino poaching is non-existent pretty much. We've never lost a rhino or an elephant in Majeti since African Parks took over. But as you say, bushmeat poaching is very prevalent, and if anything, getting worse. Malawi's in quite a sorry state at the moment, economically. As I said, we got hit very hard by cyclones this year. Last year was an extreme drought year. So people who are living on subsistence farming, which is the large majority of the population, have really struggled in the last year. And now the country itself is struggling. So we have 25% inflation rate this year, and people are just really struggling to make ends meet. And as a result, bushmeat poaching is on the rise. In Majeti, they don't actually commonly use snares, luckily for us. They actually make their own muzzleloader rifles, which sounds scary, but a lot less indiscriminate, at least. So they generally are taking bushmeat. But there are occasional instances where we find snares or gin traps, which are also horrendous.
I went and saw Colette Tracy, and they have 2 or 3 gin traps. I mean, I understand. Perhaps one of your rangers had an accident, didn't he?
Yeah, a little, quite a long time ago. Yeah, trod in a gin trap. So yeah,
Awful,
he's
terrible,
fine.
terrible,
He
terrible,
is
terrible,
fine.
terrible. Sorry,
No,
I shouldn't have brought that up. That's a terrible story.
No, they're horrible weapons as well, and needless to say, dogs are very susceptible to them. Poisoning also, and I don't know if the news reached South Africa yet, but very sadly, Luande, who received dogs at the same time as us, lost all their wild dogs 2 weeks ago to a poisoning event. So they went from 18 dogs to 0 dogs in probably less than 5 minutes. And it was a really, really awful, sad case where poachers had laced a small puddle of water with probably rat poison, and again aiming.
Strychnine.
Yeah, I can't remember. It's a local thing that they make actually, but I think it's on the same chemical composition as strychnine. But they're targeting game birds and small bushmeat game. But when a pack of dogs arrive at a small waterhole, so what they do is they dig these small puddles off the edge of the river, so it's fresh water, but it's not flowing water, because animals are much more likely to drink from that than risk the crocodiles in the Shuri River. And the dogs exactly the same. Dogs tend to avoid the rivers here. They don't play in the water at all in Majeti. And if you've ever seen dogs elsewhere, they love water. Normally they really like playing in it, but they avoid the Shuri River because it's absolutely chock-a-block with crocodiles. So I'm sure they came across this small puddle and took the opportunity. And of course, the entire pack drinks at the same time. Within minutes, they'd been completely wiped out. So there's always this fear that something's going to happen to the dogs. So we do monitor them very closely. So primarily how we do this is through the use of collars. So we have 6 adults in our pack. All of them are collared, but 2 of them have GPS collars, so I can track them from my laptop or my phone 24 hours a day. I can see where they're moving. I can also see how quickly they're moving. If they stop moving, then I get an alert. If they leave the park, then I get an alert, and these alerts just come through on my WhatsApp. And basically that allows us to really monitor this like the health of these dogs and also how they're moving around the park. The other 4 dogs have basic telemetry collars, VHF collars, which is really old technology that's been around since the 60s, but it's still really useful. Basically, you just have to get within a kilometer or so of them, and then I have like a radio receiver that picks up a beep and allows me to pinpoint where the dogs are. So that's a useful tool, because if I can't see the dogs because they're in the thick bush, I can at least use that to make sure that all the adults are there. But the other bonus of these collars is that they're fitted with anti-snare devices. So if the dog actually puts their head through a snare, then it has these wire sort of notches that stop that snare digging into the dog's neck. So they'll still be probably stuck, but we'll know they're stuck because of the GPS movements will stop or slow down. And then we can go in and rescue them if necessary, but they won't be harmed by the snare, which is really critical. So that's our primary way of monitoring them. We also use camera traps, so we put camera traps up at waterholes and things like that, so we can monitor them, and then also just respond to people's reports. So tourists that are driving around the park, they can use the latest sightings app, or most of them have got my WhatsApp number, so they send me all their pictures while I'm sitting in the office and they're out looking at my dogs. And then we have all the team in the park. I've got a team of monitoring assistants, but then also all the rangers are trained to collect data on priority species if they come across them. And then in the longer term, the other key reason we need to monitor the dogs is to understand how many of them there are, because they produce puppies like nothing else. This year they gave birth to 9. Normally by this point, so they gave birth in May, and by this point I would have only expected there to be maybe 3 or 4 left, but we've still got 8. So they're doing really, really well at keeping their puppies alive. But that means I now have a lot of dogs eating a lot of food in the park, and that combined with the 50 lions that we have, the 12 cheetahs that we have, we actually don't even know how many hyenas and leopards that we have. In a small fenced reserve, at some point, my predators, which are my children, and I love them very much, but at some point I'm going to have to do something with them because they're going to be eating all my antelopes. So we have to monitor them as part of the whole predator population and make plans as to what we do in terms of management. So with things like lions, we'd probably be looking at contracepting, because there's nowhere else in Malawi that can take lions at the moment. The wild dogs, they've still got a year or so, but I suspect by 2025, we hope that some other Malawi parks will be in a position where they're ready to receive wild dogs, so that we can then start to repopulate the rest of Malawi as well. But we never do translocations without a proper feasibility assessment. If the park is not ready, if they're not got proper law enforcement and anti-poaching in place, or if they not fenced but surrounded by very high human density, then it's probably too high risk to introduce the dogs. But we're working very closely with the government to try and get the rest of these Malawi parks in a position where we can then start repopulating other parks, because that's the whole aim, really. It's not just about having all the animals in Majeti. We want to repopulate the rest of Malawi and create a good genetic gene pool for Malawi as well.
Cool, thank you. Well, I think that's an extremely interesting and fascinating talk. Have you lost any dogs to lions in the park?
So we've just lost one puppy actually in the last few weeks, and he just went missing one day. But looking at the movements of the rest of the pack, I think it was probably lions, because they didn't stop.
Yes.
It wasn't that he was injured or sick or something, because then the pack would stay put in one place with that pup. They were hunting, and they carried on going. So I suspect he got separated during the hunt, and and possibly killed by lions because they were in a very lion dense area at the time. So yeah, but otherwise, no. Cole always is very surprised we haven't lost any of the adults yet, but let alone pups, we're doing extremely well.
So it sounds as though they're blessed under your guidance.
Yeah, I think the park is just very suitable for predators. All of our predators are doing really well.
Is it mostly Brachystegia woodland?
Yeah, so the western half of the park is Brachystegia, high Mayombo woodland. Really beautiful, a lot of highlands. It's really quite rugged and extremely beautiful. The eastern half of the park is more riverine thickets and then Mopani grassland areas.
Right.
But yeah, the dogs tend to stick in the east. Cole thought they would actually prefer the west, where it's more mountainous and a few less lions.
He doesn't know anything there.
No, he doesn't know.
He's an amateur.
We had a sweepstake about where the dogs were going to den, and he was the furthest away, and I was the closest. So I think that says it all. Really.
So you're winning. You're winning everywhere.
Yeah.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Should we open up and ask anybody if they want to ask you a question? Do you folks want to turn your camera and your microphone on and ask Rosie any questions, please?
Hi, Jeremy and Rosie. Yeah, I've got a question. You were speaking earlier about the collars that were sort of anti-snare or whatever the case may be. Have you come across any of the dogs that have been captured and you've actually arrived and they've been fine and you've had to cut them loose?
No, not in Majetti. We've been very lucky, actually. As I say, the snares are not that common. There's one strip of the park where we tend to get snares, but it's actually on the eastern side of the Shiri River, and the dogs won't cross the river. So that's good. They're pretty safe from that. But definitely in Kruger, it happens all the time. So as I was saying, you can monitor these GPS collars, and they actually send an alert if the dog stops moving, and that indicates that it's either stuck or injured or dead. And so the teams go in very quickly as soon as they get the alerts, and it's actually saving a lot of dogs' lives, because in the past you wouldn't know that the dog was stuck, and then they die slowly and painfully over time stuck in a snare. But now the teams can get in very quickly and cut these dogs loose. So they really are saving a lot of dogs' lives.
Do you have to sit
those collars? I think Greg Rasmussen was the original instigator of these collars they look like those punk rock collars that punk rockers in UK used to wear in the past. They've got like great big studs on them. They look extremely macho actually on the dogs. And what happens is if they go around their necks, the wire sort of gets stuck in those little metal studs.
Yeah.
And definitely they are helpful. I mean, it's been there's so many people with different opinions, and sitting on the sort of on the outside of the fence, I've heard so many different things over the years. But at once, I mean, some of our guys in South Africa didn't think they were a very good idea for a long time. But the Painted Dog and Hwangi and stuff, they've had good success with the studded collars, because the wire, just even if it does get traction, it's sort of stuck in this sort of minefield of metal studs.
Yeah.
But of course they can still get their leg in a snare or another part of their anatomy which is not protected by the collar. I mean, you probably have seen it too, Rosie. I mean, I've seen dogs that have managed to break a wire snare, and the snare is around their neck, and their tissue is grown around the wire.
Yeah, no, I was going to say dogs are phenomenal healers, actually. We have
just as tough as can be.
They're phenomenal. We had a dog, one of our adult males has been repeatedly injured in the last year, and at one point I thought he'd completely broken a leg and was a goner, but within a couple of days, they're just back keeping up with the pack, and yeah, quite phenomenal.
The extraordinary thing is the number of instances of dogs that have only got 3 legs.
Yeah.
That actually managed to
They
keep
can
up and
run
hunt
on 3 legs
successfully.
very
And
happily.
yeah. I mean, it's yeah. Does anybody else have anything they might like to ask?
Hi,
Frank
Jeremy. Hi, Rosie.
Thank you.
Evening.
Firstly, I just want to say thank you very much for all the hard work that both of you guys are doing in your respective fields. Without you guys out there, I think a lot of what you guys are doing obviously cannot be achieved. So I've got a question for Rosie and I've got a question for Jeremy, but I suppose, Jeremy, that can wait till later. Rosie, just a quick question from my side, not coming from, obviously, from the conservation background on my side. When it comes to reintroducing wildlife back into the parks, based on your experience, is there a specific, dare I say, science behind it in terms of what you introduce, when you introduce, how you introduce it, and also, more importantly, from where those specific species come from when you introduce them? I'm assuming there's a timeline and there's a specific science behind that. If you could maybe elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And great question. Yeah, so normally it takes about 2 years of planning before we introduce any species, because there's a lot of work that goes into it. So our policy is we don't introduce anything that we don't have evidence of that was there originally. So we only bring in back animals that we know were surviving there before they were eradicated. And that's quite critical because we want to only make sure that the habitat is right for those animals. And then depending on the species, we have to do assessments on whether the food is there for that species still, because obviously things change over time. So if that's herbivore species, then we actually have to do vegetation assessments. If it's predators, then we have to understand whether we have enough prey to support those particular predators. We look at things like water resource, we look at space, we look at competition between similar species. And then there's a big consultation process as well. So it's not just about the ecological side, but making sure that the government is on board, that even local communities understand that we're bringing wild dogs in and what this means, and making sure that we have all the measures in place to minimize the risk of anything going wrong. So like having very good fences, having these alerts set up on collars systems, training our rangers and our fencing teams to recognize the spoor of the animals. So if they see tracks of wild dogs on the fence line, then they report that into us, so that we can respond if necessary. And doing a lot of sensitization. We have a lot of people in the park who are working on foot, particularly fencing guys who are working often on their own in the middle of nowhere, fixing fences, who had never seen a wild dog before or never seen a cheetah before, and suddenly I'm putting these animals that notoriously walk on fence lines, and these poor guys are bumping into these animals on a daily basis. So I had to sensitize them that actually a wild dog and a cheetah is never going to attack you. You're fine. They're not a dangerous animal to a human being. And actually they've become my best monitoring assistants. They see the dogs and the cheetahs more than anybody else, because these are animals that preferentially walk on fence lines. So it's a long process. And then in terms of looking at which animals to introduce, that's tricky because it also comes down to what animals are available and timing wise, and also sponsorship. So nearly always these translocations are getting funded by generous donors like Painted Wolf Wines, and often these are coming from organizations that have a vested interest in somewhere already in South Africa, so they might be able to provide the animals. But ideally we are looking at the same sort of subspecies of animals that we want to introduce, but sometimes that's not possible. For instance, our giraffes that we introduced in 2018, the subspecies of giraffe that existed in Malawi 100 years ago, it doesn't exist anymore. So then we're looking at the most close relative of that, and where we can find that and whether they're available.
Giraffes are one of the most critically endangered of all species. I mean,
Yeah.
our South African giraffes are in reasonably good shape, but I mean, there are so many different variants and subspecies, and some of them are down to like 10 animals.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So,
and we're also looking at ones that are particularly resistant to certain diseases. So we have a lot of tsetse fly in Malawi. In Majeti is not so bad, but certainly further north. So we can't bring in species that are particularly susceptible. So yeah, it's a big process. We usually have a steering committee that does the feasibility assessment, and then it has to get approval. Is it cost effective? Is it is it worth our while? We obviously we could introduce every species that ever existed in Malawi, but does that make sense financially and ecologically? Especially now the parks are much smaller. Potentially they can't sustain all the different species. Rhinos in particular are struggling in Majeti, and we think they definitely used to exist there, but when it was an open system, and potentially they only lived in Majeti at certain times of year, because during the dry season they really struggle. So that's something we have learnt from. But as I said, the rhinos were introduced in 2003, which now we have 20 years of hindsight and better science and better understanding of reintroductions. It's possible that now we wouldn't introduce rhinos. But yeah, there's a lot of science behind it. There's also a lot of politics behind it, and a lot of sort of business mindedness as well. So it's complicated.
Thank you. That's great. We should probably be thinking about wrapping up. And does anybody else have anything they'd like to say? I see Rory's hand is raised.
How's it, Jeremy? Thank
Evening.
you.
How are you?
All right, and you?
Cool. It's nice to see you.
Comment there, and I just want to echo that. I think it's incredible that you donate a portion, not of your profit, but of your actual turnover to this great cause. So my question is for you, Rosie. I'm interested in the logistics of when your teams react to a dog that has been snared, whether with or without a collar, and bearing in mind it's a wild animal, obviously in a highly stressed state. Talk us through the mechanics of cutting loose a snare. I mean, do you sedate the animal? Just how does that all happen? Thank you.
Yeah. So you need vets, and in Malawi we struggle for that. South Africa has a lot of wildlife vets. You have your pick of them in a lot of parts of South Africa. In Malawi, we had one, and now she's left and moved to Chad. And there's no other qualified wildlife vets in Malawi. So we're actually in the process of training a vet. She actually runs the SPCA and the rabies eradication program for Malawi. But we're training her up as a wildlife vet because otherwise we're very limited. She's now actually very experienced with lions and cheetahs, but wild dogs are particularly tricky particularly tricky animals. But yeah, if an animal's in a snare, then basically it requires us to dart them and sedate them. Dogs, the rest of the pack will stay there, but they won't interfere. They just sit and watch a bit agitatedly, but they won't attack us. So actually it's very safe. And if the dog is in the snare, then they're limited in terms of how much they can move anyway. And then when we're working with wildlife, speed is the key. So we want the animals under for as little time as possible. So it's dart in. Normally it takes about 5 to 10 minutes for the animal to be fully asleep, and then it's in, cut the snare out, treat with antibiotics if required, and then wake the animal up and get out of there, and then monitoring that animal for the next few days basically. But yeah, basically it requires a vet. and that's our biggest challenge in Malawi at the moment.
Yeah, I guess to be able to administer the darting and the sedatives as well needs a vet. I mean, I was speaking to Jessica Watermere is a young South African woman that works in the Savi Conservancy in the southeast of Zimbabwe, and they have a similar issue in that the vet is very, very far away. At least there are vets in Zim, but she wanted to be able to do the darting herself, and actually she was stopped by the Zimbabwean veterinary authorities wouldn't allow her to do it, and eventually she had to take a special examination to be able to or go on a course to be able to dart. And that's just one aspect of it. I mean, so
Yeah.
also administering all kinds of other medication to animals that you're supposed to be trained to do.
Yeah. So Malawi's just in the last few years has just started a veterinary course in Lilongwe at the university in Lilongwe. It's very in its early days, so they're not producing vets yet, but we're very invested in building capacity of Malawian vets. I think that's the
Yes.
only way to resolve the issue.
Well,
So-
that's also important actually, is so that your veterinary community doesn't have to rely on expats all the time.
Exactly, yeah. So we bring those the fourth year vet students to Majeti every year, and they stay in the park for 2 weeks and learn all about wildlife, because they're training as vets, but most of them are going into livestock veterinary because that's what the
Yes.
government is pushing. And that none of them think about wildlife veterinary as an option. So we bring them down to the park for a couple of weeks and introduce them.
I mean, I suppose for a Malawian, the thought of doing anything with wildlife would be quite remote.
Yeah.
The sort of a lot of the flora and fauna of Malawi is so depleted, and the pressing needs of this 14 million people, or however many people there are, 20 million people in this tiny little country, sort of is overwhelming.
Yeah, no, definitely.
We have 5 minutes left, apparently, according to my thing that's come up. So I think we need to put this little baby to bed.
Yeah, no, that's lovely. I have a couple of photos if anyone wanted to see them very quickly, of the dogs arriving.
I'll put your photos up then. Go on.
Okay.
Go and show us your photos.
Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, I don't know. Let me know if you can see that picture.
That's a
Yep.
very smelly airplane arriving in Malawi.
Yeah, that's a very smelly airplane arriving in the Malawi, and that's our crates. I'll just whiz through them, but I did talk about most of this already. That's the dogs piled up, so they spoon them in the plane, and these are all the tags, the numbered tags, so that Cole knew which dogs had to come to Majeti and which dogs were going to Luwande. Very ungainly unloading them from the plane. There's our crates with our sponsors, sitting outside Cargo Malawi. This is, as I said, we had to take one of the dogs out and cover in ice because she was overheating. So that's Cole on the tarmac at Blantyre International Airport with a wild dog.
She looks exhausted. Hey?
Yeah, she perked up very quickly, thankfully. So this is a GPS collar that she's got on. This one doesn't have the anti-snare device on. I think there's probably a picture of one that does. This is them getting squished into their crates. The blindfold is just to avoid any light stimulation, because that will wake them up before we're ready to wake them up. And then this is us driving through a very busy Malawi with dogs on the back of the trucks. And this is them being released into Majeti, which was really exciting. And this, as I said, we then spent a lot of hours sitting with them at the boma to habituate them. So on the left is our park manager's daughter called Josie, and on the right is our dog called Josie. So that's her namesake. They were bonding together. And part of the process in the boma is also feeding them. So they know that we're not scary, but they didn't quite trust us in the beginning. But I've had to cut up a lot of carcasses. But it paid us well because now they're so relaxed. They sit with the cars. Tourist trucks see them all the time. They're very, very relaxed dogs. As you see, nice views from tourist vehicles of the dogs. And this is the lodge at Majetti. And the dogs like to sit outside the lodge very frequently, which is nice. We also could tell they were very relaxed because they came very relaxed with other animals in the park. Elephants hate them, but the dogs find it very fun to tease the elephants. They also like to tease warthogs a lot. They're very cheeky, these dogs. And I also said to Cole, I know they're not stressed because they play all the time. They are either sleeping or they're playing. They're very, very happy, relaxed dogs, which is nice. This was outside my house, and the dogs often come to see me in the morning and just playing around, chasing, having a lot of fun. This is actually, I think I put this picture in because this is a dog that just keeps getting injured. So he had twice he's had a very bad leg. And then this year he also had these wounds on his back, which we think is caused by a mite infestation. But it keeps healing and then opening up again. But he's not losing condition. He's in good condition. So Cole's quite happy that we just leave him for now. If we have to dart him to replace the collar, then we might give him some treatment. But generally speaking, with dogs, it's better to not intervene and just let them get on with their things and not disrupt the pack dynamics too much. This was our alpha female looking extremely pregnant about 3 days before she gave birth. So that was a very strong sort of anticipation period in May. But you can also see this is the anti-snare collar with all these metal plates on that we were just talking about. And this was the first pictures I got of the puppies, which we were so excited about. So when they're in the den, we use camera traps, so we're not disturbing them too much. And this picture just made me laugh because I just felt so sorry for Mum and for all those dogs, all those puppies coming to beg for food. And this was the first time I got to count them because they all ran across the camera in a row. So I managed to count all 9 of them in this little video, which was so cute. And they're very fat. So we knew they're doing really well. And this is the dogs now. This is about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And this is right outside the offices. They killed 2 nyalas. And these are the pups, actually. The adults were resting, but the pups were eating. So they're getting really big and very playful, almost the size of the adults now. But they're really very cute. And lots of ID kits being created for these little pups. So I'm missing them. I'm looking forward to going back and seeing them. But yeah, I've got thousands of pictures, but I just thought I'd show you a few just to give an idea of what it was like.
Thank you. That's lovely. I think we're just about to lose everybody and lose our thing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, folks, for tuning in, and we'll have another exciting one coming up in the new year. Another nice presentation.
Thank you, guys. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rosie. Thanks, James.
Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosie. Thanks, Jeremy.
Have a lovely evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Rosie. Thanks, Jeremy.
Pleasure.
Cheers, Daryl. Thank you.